The summer sun was already beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky above the coastal town of Milford Beach in golden pink hues. A light sea breeze carried the scent of salt and seaweed, and the seagulls circling over the pier called to each other softly as they finished their day. The town was located on the eastern coast of the United States, a typical resort area where tourists flocked from May to September to relax on the beach and enjoy the peaceful atmosphere of the quiet countryside. Michael Harding, 38 years old, stood on the terrace of the old mansion he had inherited from his parents, gazing at the sunset. Despite the picturesque panorama, he was lost in heavy thoughts. On the small table beside him lay car keys and his smartphone. The screen displayed a missed call notification from his wife, Danielle. Their marriage had lasted 15 years, and during that time, they had been through a lot. The loss of parents, a mortgage on the house, shared holidays, rare quarrels, reconciliations, and more quarrels. But now he felt that something imperceptibly had changed in their relationship, as if the gears in the machinery of their family were beginning to loosen. Danielle Harding, a beautiful 35-year-old woman with short blonde hair, still tried to appear happy in the eyes of others. Her relatives loved her for her kindness and gentle smile, while friends admired her for her ability to cook amazing desserts and create unique cocktails. But over the past few months, Michael had begun to seem to look right through her. An invisible wall had appeared between them, one that he could neither break nor wanted to break. She herself had become lost in guesses. Was he tired from work, starting some secret project, or simply going through a personal crisis? Yet, deep in her soul, she had long been engaged in an ongoing battle of anxiety and guilt. The sound of the front door lock clicked. Danielle returned home from the supermarket, holding 2 bags of groceries. A pizza box and a crumpled newspaper lay in the hallway. As soon as she entered the kitchen, she noticed that the floor hadn't been mopped, and the sink was full of dirty dishes. Michael, who used to often take on some of the housework, was now participating less and less, especially on weekends. The little things were leading to endless, petty arguments, which, like drops of water, were slowly eroding the foundation of their relationship. "Michael, are you home?" she called out, expecting to hear his footsteps in the hallway. No answer. She absent-mindedly glanced into the living room. Blankets lay untidy on the couch. The TV was quietly playing in the background. His suit and tie were draped carelessly over the back of a chair, as if Michael had taken them off in a hurry. The sight of the empty house was oppressive. She walked out to the terrace and finally saw him, standing with his back to her, leaning against the railing. "You didn't hear me come in?" she asked gently, but with some hurt in her voice. Michael turned around, smiled reluctantly, and said he had been lost in thought. He looked tired and irritated, although he was trying not to show it. He used to help unload the groceries, hug her, kiss her, ask how the shopping went, but now everything was different.
"Sorry,"
he mumbled, stepping aside as she came closer. Danielle felt a deep crack between them. While there could be a dozen reasons, work stress, a new landscaping estimate, car loans, general tension, none of these explained the coldness she felt with every fiber of her being. It was as if behind his distant, almost unfamiliar gaze, Michael was hiding something more than just exhaustion. The guilt she had been secretly carrying rose in her throat. She didn't know how to talk about it, knowing that she had inflicted an irreversible wound on their marriage. On this warm summer evening in the cozy town of Milford Beach, No passerby or neighbor could have suspected the chasm that had opened up in the Harding family. It had been some time since their life together began to fall apart, and perhaps they were already standing on the edge of a resolution they didn't want to acknowledge. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains of their spacious bedroom, filling the room with soft, golden light. Danielle woke up earlier than usual and, trying not to make any noise, left the room to attend to the morning chores. She had to take their 14-year-old son, Tony, to school and then head to work at the bakery where she had been employed for the past 2 years. Michael stayed in bed, tiredly pressing his face into the pillow. Recently, something had happened that Danielle had been trying to suppress from her mind. She had attended a presentation for new baking equipment in Boston. Andrew Morris, a married colleague in his 40s, a father of 2, and seemingly a man who knew the boundaries of what's acceptable, had gone with her. But after the presentation, a glass of wine, the sense of freedom away from home, and conversations about the difficulties of family life, it all spiraled into something more. Unnoticed by either of them, something occurred that she couldn't later justify. An affair, one that weighed heavily on her conscience. Since then, she had regretted it, trying to make amends before Michael, who seemed to sense something was wrong, though she hadn't told him. Their gazes met less and less. Even Tony, it seemed, noticed some tension between his parents, though he didn't understand what was happening. Meanwhile, Michael was staying late at work more often, clearly avoiding discussions about their relationship. He wasn't asking questions, which meant he wasn't getting answers. They both silently made the wound worse. But the sense of someone else's presence in their marriage, like an invisible ghost, had settled at the dinner table, in the bedroom, at parties with friends. The day went on. Danielle took Tony to school, exchanged a few words with his math teacher, Mrs. Taylor, mentioned the homework, and reminded her son not to forget his history book in his locker. She quickly hurried to the bakery, Honey and Flour, where she managed the baking. The white apron and chef's hat had become her usual uniform. There, everything was clear and organized. Flour, yeast, sugar, and precise recipes. No guessing at how someone else might be feeling. Everything was determined by technique and practice. Strangely, it was in the bakery, amidst the sound of mixers and the smell of freshly baked bread, that she found some peace. Michael, meanwhile, working as an architect in a large firm, spent his day in the office. In his spacious office, there were plans of buildings on the walls, tenders won in the past that had inspired his creativity. But now, Michael couldn't focus on the blueprints. He kept drifting back to a conversation he had with his colleague, Sarah McLean, who had casually mentioned that she had seen Danielle in Boston with some man at a restaurant. Sarah hadn't directly accused her, but her words were full of confusion. "I was at a conference that same weekend. I saw your wife at the hotel." And although Sarah hadn't made any accusations, the seed of doubt had been planted. All day, Michael caught himself drifting off, hardly noticing the sketches in front of him. When a new residential plan popped up on his computer screen, he mechanically clicked the mouse without engaging in the details. Jealousy and pain washed over him in waves as he remembered their trips together and their holidays. Between the memories of their first meeting at university and the thought of her affair, there was a painful abyss. When Michael returned home, it was already dark outside. He saw Danielle sitting on the couch in the living room, a notebook in her hands. She was writing something, twirling a pen in her fingers. Bills for electricity and water lay on the table. Tony was clearly already asleep in his room. Their eyes met, and Michael realized he couldn't avoid this conversation any longer. He sat down in the chair across from her.
Danny, We need to talk.
he said quietly but firmly, feeling a sudden chill, as though he were standing on the edge of a precipice. She nodded tensely and put down the pen. Her heart was racing, already anticipating what the conversation would be about. She knew it was impossible to stay silent forever, but she feared she wouldn't find the words to explain her actions. I want to know. Michael ran a hand through his hair, as if in despair. What happened in Boston? These few words came out almost emotionless, which scared her even more. The cold, even tone sent shivers down Daniella's spine, and her heart tightened. She tried to compose herself, looking carefully at her husband, trying to read his face. Anger, pain, disappointment. They sent me there with a colleague, Andrew, she began, her voice trembling. It was a 2-day trip. I told you about it, remember? You did, Michael nodded curtly. But not everything, right? He hesitated, clenching his teeth. Then, gathering his strength, he muttered, Sarah told me she saw you at a restaurant, and you were clearly not in a business setting. At that moment, Danielle realized she couldn't avoid the truth any longer. Tears choked her throat. She hated herself for letting what seemed like a trivial weakness destroy their marriage. But perhaps her weakness had not been so trivial. Maybe the cracks in their family life had run deeper than she had thought. Yes, she exhaled. Andrew and I, we were close. Once. It was just once. I don't know how it happened. We were drunk. I felt so lonely. And he was talking about how hard it was living with a wife who didn't understand him. It just happened suddenly, foolishly, and terribly. She didn't know where to put her hands, staring at the floor. Never before had their arguments and resentments reached such a hopeless point. Michael was silent, as if trying to grasp the fact that everything was true. He had already known, but hearing the confession meant that his last hope that it could be just a misunderstanding had shattered. I'm sorry, she whispered finally. I wanted to tell you earlier, but I didn't know how. I regret it every day.
Regret?
Michael smiled bitterly.
You know, sometimes regret isn't enough to glue a broken mirror back together.
Danielle stayed silent, for there was nothing to argue about. He was right. The family happiness she once thought was inviolable had cracked and shattered into tiny pieces. He stood up and walked to the window, staring at the dark street. The neighbor's dog barked, a car drove down the road, and the headlights flashed across the living room walls. The silence was suffocating. I don't know if I can forgive this, he finally said, turning to her. I'm not sure we have a future. My pride, my trust, it's all gone. She cried softly. After these words, there were insane questions hanging in the air, questions with no easy answers. What will happen to Tony? How do they go on living under the same roof? How to forget or forgive? Michael saw her tears and felt a sharp, contradictory emotion, pity for the wife he had once loved with all his heart, and fury at her. This contradiction tore him apart. I'll give you time, Michael said cautiously, though he didn't believe that a peaceful pause would help. But I need time, too, to think it over. With these words, he headed for the bedroom, and Danielle remained in the living room, unable to move. The clock on the wall slowly ticked away, and it seemed to her that with every passing second, her familiar life was slipping away, like sand through her fingers. The next day, Michael woke up in the guest room, where he had spent the rest of the night. The harsh morning sun seemed to mock him, casting light on the chaos that had risen in his soul. He had neither the strength nor the desire to lie in their marital bed. At breakfast, he hardly spoke, and Tony watched him with suspicion, but didn't ask questions. It was obvious that the adolescent instinct told Tony that something was wrong, but he didn't yet understand the details. Danielle offered to take Tony to school herself, giving Michael a chance to gather his thoughts. But he, as if trying to maintain some semblance of normality, declined and went out to start the car. On the way, father and son talked only about trivialities, about a math test, about who was leading the baseball championship, but didn't mention the real issues. Tony understood too well that some sort of rift had already occurred, but didn't know the details yet. Left alone, Michael decided not to head straight to the office, but to drive to the ocean shore, to a secluded spot 3 miles from the pier, where there were usually few tourists. There, under a high cliff, lay a small rocky beach that he had loved to visit since his student days. Solitude always helped him collect his thoughts. The sound of the surf usually calmed him, but this time he felt no peace. He sat on a rock and began to think about how to move forward. The idea of divorce flickered in his mind. After all, what happened couldn't be undone, and living in constant pain would be worse. But the thought of their son, of the shared memories with Danielle, of how she had once said she wanted to grow old with him on this very shore, all of it held him back from making a hasty decision. He fought with himself, but came to the conclusion that he couldn't close his eyes to the betrayal. Danielle, too, was struggling. That same day, after finishing her shift at the bakery, she sat on a bench in a park near her work to calm herself. The large oaks and maples provided cool shade, where a pair of squirrels played. She tried calling her childhood friend, Cindy Brooks, who lived in another state, to talk about everything. But when she heard her friend's greeting, she realized she didn't want to share everything and didn't call back. She simply sat, watching mothers with strollers and elderly couples holding hands walking down the path. How easy it was for others, and how difficult it felt inside her own soul. Her thoughts were chaotic. Michael knows everything. Now he looks at me like a stranger. Is he right? Of course. I don't have the right to demand his trust. Can he forgive me? Do I want to go back to the way it was, or have we gone too far? Tears ran down her cheeks, and she felt helpless. That evening, she returned home and found Michael, who seemed to have spent the entire day avoiding eye contact with her. Tony had gone to play at a neighbor's, and for the first time in years, the house felt empty. Finally, Michael came out of the guest room, briefly said that he was going to see the lawyer soon to sort out the legal details. The word lawyer hit Danielle like thunder, although she knew it was inevitable. Have we made the decision? She whispered, meeting his gaze. I don't know, he replied, lowering his eyes. I just need to understand how it's going to happen. What if we go down that road? After that conversation, the tension became almost physically palpable. They were living as if on different islands. Tony instinctively avoided asking questions and spent more time at his friend's house or at school, trying to escape the drama unfolding between his parents. Certainly. Here's the continuation of the translation. Time passed, and the couple entered a period of forced truce. Michael and Danielle behaved as politely as possible toward each other, for Tony's sake and the routine of daily life. Quiet dinners, Terse phrases and rare glances from beneath furrowed brows became the new normal for their family. They only discussed their son's problems and household chores, avoiding the painful topic. But beneath this fragile shell, tension was building up, like a wound waiting to burst. One evening, Daniela went for a solitary walk along the deserted pier. Michael, staying home, pondered what would happen if they did divorce. He would have to leave the house. The old mansion had officially passed into joint ownership, but there were still legal nuances. The thought that he might lose this little corner of his life where so much had happened stirred feelings of anger and resentment. He sat on the couch, turning over a conversation he had recently had with his childhood friend, Harry Collins, who had said something strange a few days ago. "You know, Mike, sometimes you don't just give up. Sometimes it's better to do the opposite. Make the offender regret their actions." Harry, who had once lost his wife because of infidelity, was a hard man, and it was clear he harbored a desire for revenge for the betrayal of women. Harry's words deeply embedded themselves in Michael's mind. Morals whispered that revenge on his wife was wrong, but the feeling overtook him. She had destroyed everything dear to him, and like a seed, the thought of retribution began to grow inside him. Though still vague, it was a persistent and obsessive thought. The evening dragged on slowly. He began browsing through social media and discovered Andrew Morris's page, the same man who had been with Daniela in Boston. Although the account was set to private, some information was still visible. That was enough to learn that he lived in a neighboring town, that he had a wife named Catherine, and 2 children. On the table, a cup of coffee sat beside pictures of Andrew and his family. In Michael's mind, the plan for revenge began to form. Autumn came unexpectedly fast, the leaves on the trees turning red and golden, and a cool breeze swept through the air. Tony continued attending school, always hoping his parents would reconcile, but feeling that their relationship was far from what it used to be. Michael had already met up with the lawyer 3 times, clarifying the details of the divorce, asset division, custody of the child, alimony, things that once seemed unimaginable. Seeing Michael increasingly silent and withdrawn, Daniela tried to restore communication. She suggested family therapy, though she herself was terrified to talk about her infidelity with an unfamiliar psychologist. But he stubbornly dismissed the idea, as if he had already made some decision. In truth, he was nursing thoughts of revenge, mentally running through the details. Michael contacted an old college friend, Trevor Carlyle, who worked in private investigations. Trevor specialized in locating people, verifying facts, and occasionally assisting lawyers. Michael asked him to discreetly gather information on Andrew Morris. At first, Trevor was surprised by the request, but understanding that his friend was going through a tough time, he didn't ask too many questions and promised to look into Andrew. It soon became clear that Andrew had some weak points: financial mismanagement at work, high credit debts, and ongoing problems in his marriage. Despite his outward respectability, Trevor said, "He's deep in debt and is afraid of losing his reputation, especially in front of his wife, who probably doesn't even know about his problems." All these factors were now added to the scales of Michael's dark plan. Late one evening, when Daniela had already fallen asleep, Michael sat in his office, staring at his laptop. He looked at the calculations for the asset division and wondered what he would gain by keeping everything open and honest. Leave everything as it is, move out, pay alimony, see Tony only on weekends. Such a scenario felt unbearable. He wanted Daniela to feel what he felt: anguish, fear that life was falling apart. And then In line with his dark thoughts, his phone rang. It was Trevor, providing the details he could use to frame Andrew at work and expose him in a negative light. There was an ironic mockery in Trevor's voice, but he was helping, knowing that Michael was seeking some kind of validation. "I'm not a monster," Michael whispered to himself, closing the laptop. "Sometimes the truth has to be presented in a way that makes the guilty burn." He decided that the moral suffering of his wife and her lover would be just compensation. He would ensure the divorce went through on his terms, making Danielle feel guilty, while the lover would lose his job and family. These were his thoughts, though deep inside, a quiet voice of doubt whispered that revenge would never bring true relief. But Michael was too blinded by rage to hear this whisper. Mid-November brought a chill. In Milford Beach, nighttime temperatures dropped close to freezing, and the heating had to be turned on more frequently. The town emptied. The tourist season was over, and a sleepy atmosphere settled in the streets. One morning, as Michael prepared for work, he told Danielle that he would go to the lawyer today to file for divorce. She turned pale, trying to ask questions, but he waved it off and left the door without further conversation. He only threw out that it made no sense to drag it out any longer. He saw her lips tremble, heard Tony, who had accidentally overheard, confusedly call out to his father, but Michael was determined, as if he had built a stone wall inside himself. That same day, during his lunch break, he stopped by Trevor's office and received a folder with the materials that would seriously hurt Andrew. Among them were bank account statements confirming embezzlement in companies Andrew worked with. Trevor didn't ask what Michael would do with the information, just warned, "Be careful, buddy, and don't take it too far." But Michael had already taken the first step. He discovered where Andrew worked, found his company's email addresses, and prepared an anonymous letter with attachments, compromising his enemy. All that was left was to hit send. Once he did, a strange relief washed over him, followed immediately by nausea. His heart pounded wildly. "What am I doing? Where is this going?" But the decision had been made. Later that evening, Danielle called him as he was returning home. He could hear that she was crying, but trying to speak calmly. "Michael, I understand I deserve this. But please, don't cut it all off so suddenly. Are you really ready to end everything? We have a son. We've had 15 years of life together." "I've already made up my mind," he replied coldly. "Tomorrow we'll meet with the lawyer. Get ready to sign the papers. You'll be better off without me. And I'll be better off without you." He hung up before she could continue. The familiar, sharp pain in his chest flared up, but he pushed the doubts aside, sinking deeper into the darkness of revenge. In the parking lot at home, he sat in the car for a long time, eyes closed, listening to his own heavy breathing. The mansion's windows flickered with light, but he didn't want to go inside, because there he would have to look Danielle in the eye. That night, Danielle didn't sleep. She went through photos of her and Michael, their wedding on the beach, a trip to a national park, the birth of Tony. The captions on the back of the photos read, "Happy us," "Best vacation," "Never apart." Tears flooded her face, and the pain literally scorched her heart. She felt like a person who had destroyed something beautiful just because of a moment of weakness, and now nothing would bring back what they had. But at 3 a.m, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. A sleepy Tony peeked into the hallway, but Danielle told him to return to his room. She opened the front door. Standing on the doorstep was a woman, flushed from the cold with unfamiliar features. It was Catherine Morris, Andrew's wife. Danielle had seen her photos on social media. Tall, slender, well-groomed, and elegant. Now, however, she looked exhausted and anxious. "We need to talk," Catherine said in a trembling voice. "My name is Catherine Morris. You might remember me from the photos. I'm Andrew's wife." Danielle froze. Had everything been uncovered? Was Catherine here to confront her or ask her to leave her husband alone? Shock prevented Danielle from speaking, and she silently allowed the woman into the hallway. Catherine clasped her hands together, standing tensely, as though preparing for a confrontation. I don't know what exactly happened, but Andrew said that you too," she faltered, looking away. "And now he's about to be fired for some kind of embezzlement. He insists it's Michael's fault. God, I'm so confused." Danielle felt an overwhelming anxiety. Was Catherine here to ask for help? To get the truth? Tears began to flow down her face. She motioned for Catherine to sit in the living room. They both sat opposite each other, two lost souls, and at that late hour, the heavy atmosphere of confession settled between them. "I cheated on my husband, with your Andrew," Danielle admitted. "It happened in Boston, just once, and now I'm paying for it. My husband is filing for divorce. Maybe he decided to get revenge. I don't know." "Andrew says your husband did something to expose him to his superiors. He's not just facing dismissal. There's a legal case. And we've got kids, a mortgage. I can't afford to lose everything." Catherine covered her face with her hands. "I don't know what to do." Danielle looked at her through her tears. What a terrible, tangled situation. She was burning with guilt, realizing that Michael might indeed go to extreme lengths. He had suffered so much, and she feared he wouldn't stop. She couldn't offer Catherine any relief, as she had no idea how to stop her husband from seeking revenge. "Stay the night," Danielle suggested, unable to find other words. "It's too late now. Tomorrow we'll try to figure everything out. I'll try to talk to Michael." Catherine nodded, clinging to any sign of sympathy. It was so strange and eerie. The wives of betrayed husbands and of themselves ended up in the same house, united against the calamity their men had created for each other. It was hard to explain how both marriages had come to such a dead end. Certainly, here is the continuation and conclusion of the translation. At dawn, Michael returned home. He had barely slept, wandering around the city, drinking coffee at a 24-hour diner, trying to calm himself. Seeing unfamiliar shoes in the living room startled him, and when he saw Catherine, he froze. "What is she doing here?" he said through clenched teeth when Danielle led the guest out of the guest room. Catherine awkwardly adjusted her hair. "I came to talk, but it was too late, and Danielle let me stay." Michael quickly pieced the puzzle together. Most likely, Andrew had figured out who was behind the anonymous letter and sent his wife to clear things up. Michael's eyes narrowed. "Please leave," he said coldly, looking at Catherine. "Wait," Danielle started, but he cut her off with a wave of his hand. "I don't want to hear a word," Michael snapped. "This has gone too far. I'm doing what I have to do." Catherine stood frozen for a moment, then defiantly lifted her chin. "Do you really think what you're doing is right? Breaking up our family?" "Yes, Andrew is guilty, as is Danielle, but now you're ruining the fate of our children as well. Are you really punishing not just your wife, but our entire family?" Michael recoiled, as if she had slapped him. "Our children's fate." Those words reminded him of Tony. The thought that his own thirst for revenge had gone so far that it might destroy other lives briefly sobered him. But then anger flared up again inside him. "And what about my marriage? Your husband destroyed it. Why should I care about his well-being?" "For the sake of your son," Catherine replied quietly. "This will affect him too. Children shouldn't pay for the sins of their parents." For a moment, a heavy silence fell in the living room. Michael was furious, but deep down, he felt that Catherine was speaking the truth. Still, regret and doubt couldn't stop him from his official decision: divorce. He remained firm in his resolve, and although he saw the fear and pain on Daniella's face, he could no longer stop. His anger was driving him more than common sense. "I'm filing for divorce today," he said with finality. "And don't ask me to retract the complaint against your husband. I don't care." Catherine stood there, pale and motionless. Realizing that no arguments would change his mind, she lowered her head and quietly spoke. "Fine. I did what I could." Then she grabbed her bag and left, not even looking at Danielle. Tony, who had been standing on the staircase and overhearing everything, stared at his parents with wide eyes. It seemed he couldn't accept what was happening. When he saw Michael's gaze, Michael almost gave in, but pride and pain proved stronger. He turned away and headed to the bathroom, as if he wanted to wash off the weight of the current events. Several weeks passed. All three families, Hardings, Morrises, and Tony, were living on a volcano, ready to explode. Michael had officially filed for divorce. Danielle was signing papers, sinking into a daze. Tony, confused by the situation, was angry at both parents, spending hours with headphones on, listening to loud music, avoiding conversations, withdrawing into himself. The compromising material on Andrew began to work. His company launched an internal investigation, and it seemed that Andrew was facing being fired with a scarlet letter. Meanwhile, Catherine was seriously talking about leaving him after finding out about her husband's infidelity. Andrew himself tried to ask Danielle if she could influence Michael. But Michael didn't answer the phone or reply to messages. It seemed that everything was heading toward an irreversible conclusion. But one day, when Michael returned from work, he accidentally overheard a conversation Tony was having on the phone. "Mom is crying. Dad is rude. My friend Josh says they should just not be together if it's so bad. And I'm scared no one will be there to support me because Dad will leave." These words hit Michael like a hammer. He had become so obsessed with his own pain that he had forgotten that his son was suffering too. That night, he sat on the terrace where he had once admired sunsets with Danielle. His soul was torn by memories. Her in a wedding dress, their kiss by the shore, her laughter when they cooked barbecue together. Yes, she had betrayed him. But she was the one he loved, the only woman he had ever loved. And now how could he tear Tony away from his mother, or himself from his son? Even if it was only on weekends, he caught himself thinking that all this revenge, all this anger, had dragged them into hell. By morning, he had come to a desperate decision. He would go to the lawyer and make sure the divorce was as clean as possible. He realized he was willing to leave her the house, just so Tony could have a stable life. As for himself, perhaps he would start over. The resentment and anger still boiled inside him, but the allure of revenge had faded. He saw that he had made others unhappy: Catherine, her children, and even Tony, for whom it seemed he should have been above these emotions. While Michael was driving out of the garage, a car stopped him on the driveway. Catherine stepped out, a pale, weary figure with tear-streaked eyes. She told him that Andrew, after being threatened with dismissal, decided to save himself and confess everything. However, the evidence was too serious, and now the Morrises faced the possibility of losing their house. Catherine said she was leaving Andrew because she realized that he was destroying everything he touched. "I didn't come here to beg for mercy," she finished quietly. "I just wanted to say that you didn't win much. No one won. We're all in hell." And once again, Michael felt a prick of conscience. He only watched her leave, realizing that he had fallen into the trap of his own emotions. Neither he nor his family had found relief, and now another family was falling apart. And now he wanted one thing: to lower the weapon. But there was no turning back time. A few days later, when the divorce issue was being settled at the Milford Beach courthouse, the fate of the Harding family was officially sealed. Their marriage was legally recognized as dissolved, and only the final details remained. As they left the courtroom, Michael saw Danielle gripping the railing, as if afraid of falling. He felt pity and regret for her, stronger than he had felt in the past few months. "I'll leave the house to you and Tony," he said, looking at her. "Let's make sure everything goes smoothly. I'll still be around for our son." She couldn't say a word, only nodded, but in her gaze there was a mixture of gratitude and pain. For the first time in weeks, they looked at each other not as enemies. Though their love was shattered, there was still a shared past and a shared son, for whom they both carried responsibility. Later that evening, Michael packed a couple of suitcases and left the mansion, moving into a small apartment in the city center. He awkwardly hugged Tony goodbye, explaining that everything would be okay, and that he would be able to visit the house any time. Tony stood on the driveway for a long time, watching his father's car drive away, understanding that the family as it had been was gone. Danielle stood next to him, clutching her arms to her chest, and in this silent moment, more emotions were conveyed than in any words they could have exchanged. Weeks later, Milford Beach was finally blanketed in winter. Despite the southern coastline, wet snow occasionally fell, hot chocolate was served in the cafes, and homes decorated with garlands reminded everyone that Christmas was near. In this new reality, everyone lived with their own wounds. Michael settled into his new place, trying to build a relationship with Tony from a distance. Danielle struggled to make ends meet, running the household and occasionally asking friends for help. Andrew Morris fought against the investigation at work, and Catherine had moved to her sister's house in another state, filing for divorce. All those touched by this cycle of infidelity, hurt, and revenge were left with internal scars. Time passed. One day, Tony suggested that his parents meet at his basketball game. This meant a lot to him, and they both agreed, though they feared seeing each other again. Before the game, Michael went up to Danielle and briefly wished their son good luck. And although they stood far apart on opposite ends of the bleachers, Tony smiled, seeing that they had both come to support him. When the game was over and people started to disperse, Danielle lingered at the exit and caught Michael's eye. He silently approached, looking down. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Tony did great," he smiled back. "Listen, maybe we could have dinner sometime, the three of us, as friends. I know it's complicated, but he needs both of us." She nodded in agreement. Something stirred inside her, both pain and gratitude, and a bittersweet joy. They both understood that the past couldn't be undone, but perhaps they could find a new way of relating to each other, a civilized dialogue for their son's sake. At that moment, behind them, a teammate was laughing, hugging his girlfriend, and someone from the stands shouted, "Great game! Well done!" And so, one chapter of their story ended. The family had broken apart, but in the shards of trust, there remained a glimmer of hope that time would soften the pain, that Tony would find balance between them, and that each would learn from this tragedy. Michael still felt echoes of guilt for his revenge. Daniela was still consumed by regret. Andrew and Catherine had disappeared into the shadows, losing each other. But life continued. Although their marriage was no more, there was a chance to learn to live differently. Perhaps this wasn't the end, but only the beginning of a new path for each of them. Sometimes, to turn the page, one must first go through many mistakes, losses, and goodbyes. And though everyone carried scars, who knows? Maybe these scars would help them grow stronger. Of course, no one could guarantee that fate wouldn't bring them together again, forcing them to spin in the whirlpool of emotions. But on that day, when they first gathered at the game after the divorce, Daniela and Michael felt that they had been able to close one chapter and free themselves from the burden of unfinished business. Perhaps now they would learn to live again, with the shadow of the past, but with hope for the future.